The world building in RWBY is great, and I'm tired of acting like it isn't. Let's talk about it. I should probably first explain what I mean when I say something has good world building, because that can mean a lot of different things. Is the world in question a unique or novel concept? Is it well thought out and fully sensible? Does it seem realistic or plausible? And while all of these things could be part of a well-constructed world, I think any fictional world feels much emptier if it can't serve one important purpose. That purpose being to facilitate further storytelling within its world outside of just the main events and primary cast. Some aspects that I think can serve this purpose well are 1. Interesting and entertaining side characters that can be further explored, can have their own arcs that happened either before, during, or after the main storyline. 2. A variety of factions, organizations, and locations that can be used for setting and give characters things to interact with. 3. A wide scope that gives freedom to create new concepts within the world that could still be plausible for said existing world. 4. Sources of universal conflict any and all characters living within the world have to deal with regularity. A lot of great well-built worlds in fiction feature most, if not all of these things, examples to me being Star Wars, The Elder Scrolls, and Avatar The Last Airbender. In fact, we can see, given just how much content there is in all of these worlds outside of just primary storylines, like comics and books for example, that there's a lot to go off within these worlds, and I think RWBY is in the same realm of being able to do that. Though, what I'm sure you're more interested in, and then that statement alone, is me showing my work and seeing how the world of Remnant stands up to the standards I already set. Well, you're in luck, because that's what I plan on doing. Get ready. Part 1. Minor characters. Of the 4 aspects I mentioned, this is the least in-depth, though it is still worth mentioning because if you look at Star Wars in both Legends and in Disney canon, you can see that one source they pretty regularly use for storytelling are characters that don't get much screen time in the mainline movies. In comics and TV series, for example, they've told stories that heavily feature characters like Darth Maul or Boba Fett, and while less used in those two, Bossk and Commander Cody also feature pretty often in Clone Wars. And the reasons why I think this can work so well is because those characters already had fairly interesting things going on with them when they're first seen. Storytellers are able to take a look at them and say, what else can we learn about them? What are they like if they're put in different contexts? How can they change? Can we show what happened to them before the events that brought them here? And when I look at the more minor cast of RWBY, I can say, yeah, there's some characters I think you can tell some pretty interesting, compelling stories with, and for this purpose, I'm actually going to ignore Team Coffee, Team Sun, as well as Torchwick and Neo, because those characters are the subject of novels that already exist, so that's kind of cheating. But characters I think could definitely be used for this purpose exist here. For example, I think you could tell stories about a younger Maria Calavera, back when she was the Grim Reaper. Those could be pretty action-packed. We could have a pretty fun romp seeing what kind of monsters she took down, explore new kinds of Grim, and the themes for her story are really only limited and determined by what you put her up against, which gives freedom to the storyteller. Another character that could be followed could be a younger Gira Belladonna. Get a look into what things were like back when he led the White Fang. We know he favored more peaceful solutions to the problems of the Faunus, but what's his philosophy on executing that? What's his strategy? What is the way in which he advocated for civil rights? His story specifically could feature more thematic weight and have some political intrigue and drama to go with it. I could also bring up Pietro Polendina, or Team Stark, or one of Oz's past lives, but you get the point. There are characters that can be used to tell interesting stories outside of the primary cast. And when I'm suggesting this way in which minor characters influence world building, I'm not even really outright suggesting that Rooster Teeth or some fanfic author actually make these stories. But what I'm trying to point at is that when minor characters have intrigue to them, it means that you, the audience, can ponder on the idea of what their story was like. And that makes the world feel more lived in. It connects you to the world as a whole more. Part 2. Factions. Interesting factions make any world feel more alive. Though faction may be a bit too rigid of a word to describe it, I do feel it gets the point across. Generally speaking, I'm referring to a group of people who are in some way similarly aligned, whether that be ideologically, occupation, or the company they keep. They also typically should often be within proximity to each other, if not living together outright, and if they don't know everyone else in the faction, they should at least have many connections within it. Though small factions, they probably should all know each other, but larger ones it can be a little looser. For example, the Jedi Order can be considered a faction. They are all galactic peacekeepers who use the Force. They can have disagreements with one another occasionally, but they are aligned in that fact. And guess what RWBY is largely designed around? That's right, the Huntsman Academies. Although in the end, Huntsmen and Huntresses are their own more individual entities, the existence of the academies kind of aligns things together. Huntsmen who go work for more nefarious entities come across as more being rogues, so Huntsmen do kind of come across as being a faction aligned in their purpose of destroying Grimm. On top of this, having there be teams while Huntsmen and Huntresses are students gives a clear reason why some would be closer to each other than others. Hell, the teams kind of force a little bit of built-in found family for the characters. All of these aspects of the way Huntsmen work come together to provide a lot of different opportunities for storytellers. You're dealing with a bunch of different characters who, while they are all skilled warriors, could have a variety of different motivations and ambitions, all interacting with one another. Teams can have as many different dynamics with each other as any possible group of 4 people you can think of. You can really tell any kind of story with a group of huntsmen. It really just depends on what you can come up with as a storyteller. Here, the world sets you up with a faction that's a source that can possibly just let your creativity run wild, and to me, the purpose of world building is to free your imagination to what's possible within it. Anything is possible, and while I'm saying this, that actually leads me to the next place where RWBY's world building truly shines. Part 3. Scale. I don't want you to get confused by what I mean when I say scale or scope, mainly because I don't want you thinking that just because a world is large in size that it succeeds here, because a large world doesn't do much if we don't know that much about what goes on within it. For example, She-Ra and the Princess of Power is a show that I actually like quite a bit, but I think it kind of falls short for me in this area, because even though the world kind of encompasses the whole universe, we barely see any of space within the show. We see 2 planets that are basically desolate, and we see Horde Prime's ship. We meet 3 characters that are from other planets, and they're only in 1 episode. We have no knowledge of what things are like on planets outside of Etheria, and even there's still some stuff we don't know about. What's Selenius like outside of just being a port city? Hell, I don't even know if Bright Moon has civilians, because I don't know if it's a city or just the castle. So, this is an example of doing scope and scale wrong. There's lots of things we don't know much about. It gives a storyteller very little to go off of if they're going to create a new story, because we don't know how the world operates normally. To contrast this, Remnant is much smaller, yet it feels expansive because we have context over what locations are like culturally. What is the context for this place to exist, and how does it interact with the rest of the world? The combat schools and huntsman academies help with this because it seems that many towns have their own combat school, which creates a pipeline between villages, cities, and academies. On top of this, the technology feels pretty modern and contemporary, though occasionally has a bit of a fantastical twist because of dust, so scrolls, all the crazy weapons, and all that don't feel out of place. But this is just the world logic. How does this help you tell a story? Well, having extensive knowledge of a fictional world gives you a rule set for telling stories within it. If there are trains and airships, you know that traveling long distances is possible when needed. Scrolls tell you that remote communication is possible. What kind of weapons there are tells you how combat works. Learning that Crescent Rose is also a gun sets you to not be surprised when other weapons serve multiple purposes. Knowing what can be expected of this world enables storytellers to come up with new ideas that work within the universe. If there's one boat that travels between Vale, Mistral, and Menagerie, then there's probably other boats that do the same thing. We know these boats still operated even when remnant-wide communications are down, so it seems that these ports are very important to the people in these places for multiple reasons. These ships will have many travelers on them. The reason these characters are traveling to their destination has endless story potential. But scale doesn't just have to do with the locations. It can also have to do with the magic system, which in this case is semblances. Semblances seem to be capable of an infinite number of things. It could be as simple as just having incredible reflexes, or as complex as summoning creatures to your aid. In the show itself, we see this variety, and given that there seems to be few, if any, limits on what a semblance can do, it frees storytellers to come up with whatever ideas they want as far as what their characters can do. They can emphasize their character semblances as much or as little as they want. We've seen both in the show and in the novel situations where characters feel shame over what their semblance is and try to control it as best they can. Feeling something that is inherently part of them is a curse they're burdened to bear, and that's just as a subplot in larger stories. That concept can potentially be used as the main focus of a much more contained and intimate story. Semblances are one of the 2 most unique and novel aspects of RWBY's world building. What is the most unique aspect? Well, that gets its own section. Part 4. The Grimm. Post-apocalyptic stories have a habit of catching people's attention, don't they? Particularly the worlds of them, the results of the apocalypses. I think part of the appeal is that anyone living in a post-apocalyptic world has a lot of shared problems. The zombies, or radiation, or mutated monsters, or whatever else. There's something in the world that puts most characters on somewhat equal footing, something that is truly everyone's problem. The issue with this is that a lot of times the world as a whole is also dead. I mean, that's the entire point of an apocalypse, right? But what if you want your world to have those constant threats, but also not to have the world be destroyed? Well, in that case, you make the Grimm. The thing that makes the Grimm so special is their behavior. Think about it this way, in most fantasy stories, the special monsters like trolls, giants, even some versions of dragons still in a lot of ways just behave like fairly normal animals, where if you just stay away from the places that they regularly inhabit, then you're safe. They aren't going to actively seek out large groups of people. The Grimm don't work like that. The added element of them being drawn by the negative emotions of people makes them particularly dangerous. They sense when you're afraid, or sad, or angry, and that makes them conceptually horrifying. Their MO is to attack people while they're already weakened. Sure, they'll attack anyone when they come across, but they will actively seek out the afraid, and that gives them lots of potential to be used for horror purposes, especially given that there are different varieties of Grimm with different tactics, different aesthetics, full-on different powers, all with the purpose of killing people. The variety of horror Grimm can be used for is astounding. On top of this, they can also, much like zombies, serve the purpose of making characters that are on opposite sides of a conflict come together. Grimm don't discriminate based on kingdoms, factional associations, or anything like that. They just want to eat people and will track your fear to do it. Imagine a situation where characters are arguing over some petty squabbles just for a Grimm attack to interrupt it. And in the fight, they realize just how meaningless their fight against each other is. On top of all this, the Grimm also connect to basically everything else about the world. Why are the huntsmen and huntresses a thing? Because if there's dangerous creatures that could come attack and destroy a town at any moment, you need some people around who are proficient at destroying those creatures. That's just a necessity if towns are going to be able to survive. This also explains why the Huntsman Academies are such an important thing in Remnant. Those schools produce the people who will protect everyone from these monsters. Why would the headmaster of Atlas Academy have a seat on the council by default? Because of how important the academy is to protecting the kingdom's people from Grimm. This also kind of explains why most towns and cities we see in the series have substantial walls, in spite of this mostly being a modern setting, because a big wall buys some time in case of a Grimm attack. It gives more time for any huntsman within the town to prepare, and also buys time for extra huntsmen to get to your town before the Grimm break in. Sure, I haven't harped that much on the world logic in this video, but if you want some good examples of it, you can see that much of the world building seems designed around the fact that, yes, there's a bunch of monsters out there that will seek you out and track you down to kill you when you are at your weakest. If you really want to get into it, the Grimm explain why, in a world with guns, a lot of swords and spears still find use, and why so many people's weapons serve multiple purposes. Because when you come up against a creature that is coming directly after you, trying to kill you at close range, you need as many options as possible. You need to have your gun and your sword be one and the same. Sure, you want to keep it at a distance, but if it gets close, you need something to fight it off effectively nearby to you. And all of this combined to make me think that Grimm are one of the most genius concepts put into a fantasy story, and are the core of what I think is one of the most interestingly built worlds in all of fantasy or science fiction. Maybe some people would call some of my points in this video something like, I don't know, the fanficification of world building, but what I've realized over time is that when it comes to world building, I'm not asking for a lot. I want to know what the people are like, as well as the stories, folklore, and faiths that influence them. I want to know how locations relate to each other, and yeah, this does kind of go back to something simple. I want to know enough about the fictional world to have a general idea of what it could plausibly be like if I lived there. Sometimes I think stories give a bit too much exposition. tell you too much, and when you get to that point, you can't really feel it anymore. Because none of us know everything about what goes on in our own world, our own country, own state, own city, or hell, even the building we live in. We don't know the whole history or full present, at least not in extreme detail, and we sometimes get details wrong, or distorted, or don't know when something is missing. We should be let to understand by knowing a lot, but not everything. No matter what weird magic system, what monsters or fantastical feats of engineering, no matter how alien or how many aliens there are in a fictional world, I still want to feel the humanity. And I guess that's why I love the worlds of Elder Scrolls, of Fallout, of Star Wars, of The Dragon Prince, of Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beasts, of a number of other stories I love, and yes, of RWBY. I virtually guaranteed to talk about the stories and world of all the things I just mentioned, and even more at some point, but what connects me to them is the same. Thank you for watching.